My job is to discuss these two presentations and the papers and concepts around them. And I have to say that having read over the weekend both the background material that they had sent me and then yesterday the slides, or last night the slides, I just have to say that I learned a tremendous amount. I found it extremely interesting. But likewise, with my critical academic mind, there were several parts where I shook my head and said, I don't think this is quite right or not. But I realized that these are just like any student who's first encountering something, and so bothering you with my questions would be a little like a student in the class, and I think it would be a waste of time for all of the people here. So my comment in the traditional discussant role is, this is very interesting things. I learned a lot. I encourage you all to read them. I have nothing to criticize that wouldn't be, I think, potentially useless, or at least potentially useless to the audience, even if it would be very useful to me to ask you a lot of different questions. So what I thought I would do in this, and following in the spirit of this conference, is instead to use the 14 minutes that I have to pose a little bit of a different challenge to the authors, as well as to the different authors and participants in this conference. And the challenge is, how do you persuade an economist? So I want to go into what persuasion is. Let me tell you the background in which I come from. I mean, I started my economics career working on some of the topics that I've been broached through. I did my thesis was in attention. I worked a lot on models of information, looked at data on surveys of inflation and others. And then gradually I've moved, so I started as a very, if you want, in the fringes economist. And gradually I've moved to become a very mainstream economist. Now I'm very excited about QE. I find this extremely exciting, and central bank balance sheets and inflation dynamics. And so in doing that move, I had my experience of persuading economists and others of what things to look at. So what I'm going to be talking about is, again, I'm going to give you some rules for persuading economists, or some thoughts on them. I want to be very clear, these are not rules to persuade me. I disagree with some of them. But they're my representation of what I think I've done in my career path. So here they are. First, economics is an incredibly large and diverse field. Moreover, we train our very ambitious graduate students, who are both very ambitious and two very competitive, economics is a very competitive field, to pursue what we call intellectual arbitrage opportunities. If you are teaching neuroscience, there's some student who sneaked into the back of your room and he's there learning what you have to say so that you can steal it and use it in economics. If whatever gets published in the American Journal of Sociology is being read by some empirical economist to steal your idea and apply it in an economics term and so on. So never say economists don't do X. Economists do everything, all the X's you may have thought of, and there are models that have done so. And again, you may look at this in the uncharitable way in which I put it, they steal your ideas, or you may do it in a very charitable way, which is economists are very open to new ideas, because they're very competitive for bandwidth and attention and for opening new ideas. At the same time, economists do obsess over opportunity costs. And what is very hard to penetrate, and ideas that are very hard to penetrate in economics, is that your idea, or your neuroscience, sociology, political science, or whatnot, gets incorporated into the mainstream of things that we teach students when it comes to, say, an undergraduate education. And why is that hard? Because all the economists that I see in this room and others, we're all competing to win that battle as well, even within economics, let alone from outside of economics. And we all understand extremely well opportunity costs. For me to spend 3 weeks teaching neuroeconomics to students, I have stopped teaching them about poverty aid. It's not, oh, I'm going to stop teaching them something completely irrelevant. No, I'm going to stop teaching them something that's actually very important. The opportunity costs are high. For me to start teaching them about complexity and forecasting in different ways, I have stopped teaching them about what central banks are and what they do in the world. So opportunity costs are high, and that is important for you to understand. Economists are very open to all ideas. A different thing is whether your ideas make it to the textbook, and that's much harder. Second, famous dictum of economics. It takes a model to beat a model. What do I think economists mean by this? It's not enough to say that what I'm doing is wrong. It's not enough to say that what I'm doing could be better. Could be done better. Show me how to do it better. You need to give me a theory. You need to give me something such that I can improve. Otherwise, I smile. I'll go to dinner with you. You'll tell me why everything I do is wrong. I'll smile. I'll say, yeah, I kind of agree with that. And next day I'm going to wake up and do the same thing because I want to make progress. And it takes for progress, it means that you have to tell me how to change things as well than others. Third and similar, or third and related, economists are very, now I couldn't resist introducing my own little comments and parentheses, perhaps very pragmatic and applied. We're there to answer some very precise questions. We have clear questions. We have key facts that we want to answer. Even the ones of ours who are theorists and very hardcore theorists are starting from one key fact that you're trying to explain, one clear question that you're trying to answer. Economists are very far from philosophers in that sense. We don't understand the structure of knowledge. We want to answer one particular, very clear and very sharp answer. That does mean that economists very often lose the forest for the tree, or look under the lamppost as opposed to what reality is. But that comes not from imbecility, it comes from being extremely pragmatic and saying, I can answer this, even if it's what's under the lamppost or not. Fourth, never ignore incentives. We're obsessed with incentives. We're obsessed with the fact that if you do something to people, and we deal with people all the time, people will respond in certain ways. We really dislike, or we really resist to very mechanical models of behavior. Let's say that people will do something just because they do it, and not because they respond to what the environment is around them and what the incentives are for them. Fifth, and likewise, we never ignore markets and equilibrium. You can have a wonderful model of individual behavior. They'll be interesting, but we have learned over the last few decades from the advent of game theory and others that it's important to understand is how do markets aggregate the behavior of several. How is it that if you behave in a certain way, they will impact the market and feedback into the way you behave yourself. That is the concept what economists call equilibrium, which again people misinterpret as much as they misinterpret models, and we shouldn't have used those words perhaps. Equilibrium does not mean any stationary, it doesn't mean it's good. It just means that you took into account of the feedback between what I do to the environment and what the environment does to me. Sixth, economists don't like black boxes. We like to be able to tell stories. It goes back to the pragmatic and the applied, but we like to come up with logical sequences where we say that if you do X, Y responds in a certain way and Z responds in some other way. We think that that's what knowledge, when economists say, I don't quite understand what you're saying, what they mean is I don't understand what is the X, the Y, and the Z in your logical thought. So, again, showing me, oh, here is some simulations of things that work very well, unless I understand how they got there and what the logical link was, is not going to impress, I think, many economists very much. Seventh and related, we don't do a lot of forecasting. Maybe we should do a lot more. Policymakers certainly would like us to do forecasting. What we do is instead is counterfactuals. Less of what's going to happen tomorrow, but more of if the Bank of England does X, then will that change what happens tomorrow by Y or not? Note that, by the way, we have gone to this partly through the fault. I'll blame the policymaker here, Andy Haldane, partly because of our relationship with policymakers. We go to the Bank of England, to the Treasury. I guess I should blame the Treasury since I know. And we say, I forecast a recession next week or next month and so on. And 100 out of 100 times, we don't get a, wow, thanks so much, bye-bye. I'm going to go and work on that. We get a, why? What was it that causes recession? That's the hate black boxes. B, what can I do with my policy to change whether I have a recession or not? Those are the questions we always get. A forecast never takes you too far. It's great to have a good forecast. I'm not saying they're not good to have. But you always get those two questions right away. 8, we're sensitive to data mining and out-of-town predictions. This is more of a macro fact. We have experience over the years and failed over and over at saying, give me a large data set, a small data set, a medium data set, and I fit a lot of models and I get lots of great in-sample fit, and give it a couple more weeks, a couple more data points, a couple more semesters, and the whole model just collapses because it's simply not predicting outside of the sample. Okay, we're just burned by this. It's not something that we agreed we wouldn't like. We're just burned by decades and decades of this happening. Okay, so for it, the class example, or a great example from not that long ago, was when Google came up with these ways to forecast an employment rate from whether people search for unemployment benefits or not. They're very excited because they got lots of great fit. Economists started thinking, okay, fine, you got great fit, but how does this look forward? And those Google forecasts crashed over and over again, month after month. And then the Google scientists would come back, and I sat in conferences like this, where they would say, oh, but we've now changed the model, and now it explains really well the last month. And at some point, economists were laughing at the Google people. Because look, your model just crashed every week, and so what do you mean? It was always very good at telling me why the employment went up 6 months ago, based on Google searches 6 months ago, but it was never be able to do much ahead of it. We're very worried about the so-called Lucas critique. And what I mean by this, we're very worried about the fact that if you forecast a recession, or if I forecast a recession, I know that the Treasury is going to do something about it, and that's going to necessarily invalidate the forecast in a way that I have to take into account, otherwise I'll be perpetually be getting my forecast wrong. We're perhaps too worried about this. Very often policymakers and agents don't respond to what we say, and as a result, Lucas critique is actually much less empirically relevant than people make it. But we do worry extremely about it. And finally, for my 10th point, because I had 9 points, I thought it was good to come up with a 10th one, like round numbers. But actually, that was a joke. Sorry, only 3 of you laughed. Thank you. No, but actually there was. But there's actually some meaning to this. And what I mean by like round numbers is the like simplicity, which have come up already. Economists like simplicity, and why? You see it from my list above. We like the simplicity so that I can understand that this is not a black box. I understand what's going on. I can make counterfactuals. It doesn't take forever to run the program or in real time and so on. So, having told you my 10 rules, what I thought I would do is tell you how I think the 2 presentations did in this regard. So let me score you guys on this regard. And I think you're perfectly, by the way, legitimate to say, one, I couldn't care less about persuading economists. I'm just telling you some useful knowledge. Whether you're persuaded or not, it's your problem. That's absolutely legitimate. But I thought this would be useful in this audience, and given that it's about rebuilding macroeconomics, is to what extent, and this is not, again, I am in no way competent to judge whether what you said was right and represents neuroscience or not. I just don't know it. But some reactions from, I think, an economist. And again, I've been very careful to say this is not me, so you don't have to say, oh, it's Ricardo believes in Rule 7 and who cares. These are my impressions from dealing with my own tribe. So let me try to score Edmund and Lenny and Erica on this. So on the first one, so let me start with what we learned, what I learned a tremendous amount here from the work that Edmund described. Classical economics is this. Macroeconomists use representative agents. No, some of us do, some don't. Depends on the question. There's lots of other models. Heterogeneity in different reward functions. Some of my colleagues like utility functions with 75 different arguments. Some write them with 1. It depends on the question. Heterogeneity. I've done a lot of work with heterogeneity. I write models in the computer. Take forever to solve. There's literally a continuum of agents. That's infinity. The infinity of agents. So economics is very large and diverse, but obsessed over opportunity costs. Moreover, even on some of the points that you made from your career, which were extremely important, interesting, and this piggybacking into number 2, where I think, so I would say 1 no, but 2 yes. The idea that that economists will listen to the way in which we judge rewards and think about gains, losses, as well as different possible reward functions. We gave a Nobel Prize to 2 psychologists, Kahneman and to one who was alive then, Danny Kahneman, for doing this. Why? They actually made a huge effort to write a model and publish in the Economic Journal to try and conceptualize some things. But also some of the ideas that you have put, which have been already influential in economics, my students, Philippe Mateshka and Alistair McKay, as well as Louis Stevens with Mike Woodford and Andrew Kaplan himself sitting there, have been thinking about decision errors that are probabilistic, that come with errors. They've been using your ideas, stealing your ideas if you want, and putting them into models, and those ideas are getting a lot of traction in economics, and they're doing it. Have they made it to classical economics? I'm looking there at Andrew. I think he would wish that he could, and he's fighting for it every day in economics debates, but there I think the opportunity cost is important. Third, economists are very too much pragmatic and applied. Yes, there may be 100 reward systems, but that's just not enough pragmatic and applied for me. There's 100, there's lots of different rewards, then I get too much worried about, well, but which one is driving which action at what point? This is not to say that it's hopeless or right to think about that, but then one needs a very clear categorization of which apply when or not. Fourth, never ignore incentives. And I think there, Edmund's presentation was spot on and didn't ignore incentives. Agents have different reward systems, especially they have a rational and an impulsive different decision making. Depending on the circumstance, they respond to the incentives. They respond to what it is. They respond to the incentives of being given too much glucose. They respond to with training to what to use. That was just, that spoke to my heart as an economist as you went through all those different things. I saw diminishing marginal utility. I saw a lot of interesting things there. Marx and equilibrium, though, that's a cheap shot. Neuroscientists forget about Marx and equilibrium, think about decision theory, so I'm not going to judge you at all on that. Six, hate black boxes. And again, here I give you very good marks. So I think your presentation was very useful because again, there was a model theory. Let me call model. Model is a bad word after your presentation. A theory of how things X responds to Y, the response to Z, and I could understand how some of those things work. Counterfactual forecasts, again, very much high marks insofar as that was what you said. If I stimulate the brain in a certain way, then people will respond a certain way. Not will I tomorrow buy sugar or not, but if I give you some sugar now, what will sugar do in different ways? Eighth, a little more worried, or less of a high grade, sensitivity to data mining. A lot of these things are definitely in the neuroscience are in the lab with the agent or the particular example. To what extent can we apply this outside of that environment? I think it's a very open question, and certainly once I aggregate through the market equilibrium and others are not. We are worried about the Lucas critique. Again, insofar as you talked, you have different models, different counterfactuals, different heuristics. I think that's good. But on the simplicity, I think the round numbers, not so much insofar as, okay, fine, there's 100 reward systems. Tell me the 3 that when I'm trying to study an agent buying a house that I should care about. And I'm totally fine with you telling me, and here's the other 2 that when I'm thinking of an agent not buying a house, but instead choosing their meal, they should worry about. And there the economists are eclectic and fine. Let me turn to the second presentation. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, not doing great on time, but I'll rush it a little. First, on the first one, very persuasive. As you said, there's lots of different models. There isn't just one model. That's exactly, again, music to the ears of an economist. We use lots of different models, depending on the circumstance, depending on exactly what it is that we're trying to explain. Some principles. I listed here some of them, but certainly in that regard. At the same time, it takes a model to be the model. And here I wasn't quite sure, because again, it depends a little bit on what you mean by the words. Especially I found very, very insightful an article that Lenny had, that he sent me with James Berger, I think, for me to read, in that had a model in the sense of a theory of systematically going about fitting the data. Now, I think they are rightly saying, well, but we don't want to call that a model, because we mean by model by something else. But here, they are giving me at least a systematic way to go and confront data in order to think about things, and in order for me to improve in some ways. Third, they were very pragmatic and applied. In that paper that he sent me, it was all about how is it that the absorption system of a car would respond to some bumps. You saw here predicting weather and others, and either you improved or not. So there were certainly very applications, yes. On the fourth one, though, the incentives, not so much. I mean, as you well put it, and the weather is a great example of this. The big difference from the weather is that when I forecast is going to be, if you forecast that there's going to be a heat wave in Pakistan, I believe it was, in Pakistan, and then the agency sends the rescue for it. On the one hand, well, but how is it that your forecasts, as they get made sooner or later, changes the incentives of the agency? And may we end up actually with less or more aid insofar as we forecast it in different ways? Second, to what extent is it that as we get much better weather forecasting, but also we come up with physical ways in which to affect the weather, to what extent that will start hurting the forecasting themselves, at least in localized ways. And this with relation to your swamp and others in that. So far, of course, once you forecast a little bit the progression of the swamp, I can go and intervene in the swamp and change it in different ways. And I didn't see how one deals with that problem there. Fifth, on Marx equilibrium, I actually thought that you were doing what economists we think into equilibrium, which is to what extent the interaction between different models, errors, can lead you down the big exit. That I found very persuasive. On 6, though, it felt a little like a black box. There was these models, there was these forecasts, and I have trouble telling myself exactly why is it that the big exit comes here and why is it not. Now, that's not true of the butterfly and the Hawthorne effect, which those, I understand the logic, I understand the mathematics for it. But for some of the others, like the weather, it was very hard for me to be able to understand a number pops out, but where did the number come from, as opposed to the logic that came to it. Where I think the scoring is tougher for you is this one, the counterfactual versus forecast. And I think that perhaps, that's my too much, economists worry too much about counterfactuals and not enough about forecasting. There's very little investment in economics on forecasting. Very, very little. Much too little in my view. We could do a lot more forecasting, partly for the other reasons. But it is the case that forecasts, we do have this bar that we'd like to do counterfactuals. Like I told you, that's the experience talking to the Andes of the world is, fine, that's your forecast, but if I do this, how will that change or not? And I really can see at all how your methodology can be used for this forecasting issue. The stability and data mining, in a sense, I don't know. You tell me about it, meaning those big exits, to what extent are they good in past data versus out of sample? I think these are definitely issues I could see from the slides that you've thought about. It didn't come across to me to what extent they would be applied and whether this is a criticism or a virtue of her approach. And then on the Lucas critique, again, well, it goes back instead to the forecasting and the equilibrium, which I repeat with. So, on conclusion, and I think 3 minutes over my time, or 4 minutes over my time, so apologies. I found all this work very useful. I think to make progress, it's important to understand what are the things that kind of excite economists or not. Maybe wrongly, and maybe we should have a conference on why economists should stop doing 9 or 8 or one of these. But also I try to give you a flavor of what did I find, or what I found even that my colleagues would find exciting about some things you said, and some that I think they would find not so exciting or at least objectionable, and hopefully open the discussion for you to answer. Thank you.